ready? Okay, in the mic, please. 5, 4, 3, 2, action!
Welcome to the Weekend Uptake. I'm Jennifer Wiggum, and we are coming to you live from downtown St. Paul in the shadow of Minnesota's state capitol. Coming up this week, we will talk cyber wars with John Hoffus, and our roundtable tackles taxes, tea parties, and high-speed trains. But first, our senior political correspondent, Noah Cunin. Noah?
Thanks, Jennifer. Now, all across the country this past week, the tax day tea parties erupted in general protest against taxes and a growing U.S. deficit. Now, I was in Washington, D.C., covering one of these tax parties, and organizers attempted to dump 1 million tea bags, that's $10,000 worth, in front of the White House. But when Washington, D.C. district officials put the kibosh on that, they loaded those tea bags back into a truck and sent them into exile. I tracked down where those tea bags went and ended up at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a Washington, D.C. think tank, and found out a lot about how these protests were organized. We'll cue that clip now, and when we come back, an interview with John Hoffus.
We have to worry about whether or not we're the right shaped vegetables and so on. Regulatory taxes, the overall indirect taxes, and the general level of taxes overall are all things CI is involved with. CI is a activist public policy free market group, and we're integrated, vertically integrated in the sense that we go from preparing the intellectual ammunition, the analytic work, market it, build alliances, and then actually engage the advocacy process, sort of a soup-to-nut approach, trying to make good policy, good politics.
What has been your participation in the activities today on April 15th?
Well, as you can see, we're actually having a lot of fun putting together packages. CI has long been involved in addressing the overall burden of government, the tax in the broadest sense, the way in which government taxes its citizens by burdens that are often hidden and so forth. And what we're seeing is more and more an attempt to move us from this is what we think this is the burden we're going to place on you because we think it's worthwhile, to indirect taxes, the green tea taxes now, as we're now talking about, global warming taxes that Michelle Bachmann and Chris Horner have talked about in the past, but also regulatory taxes, the way in which we have to fill in forms, we have to have to apply for applications. There are decisions that they're going to impose a massive regulatory tax on the U.S. economy and the U.S. consumers, the whole taxation of the financial service industry through regulation, burdens through tax regulation, but also their proposals for cap and trade. Their decision that we're going to impose a charge every time we cut our lights on, we move our cars, we make ourselves more comfortable, we do anything that involves energy use, which is essentially everything we do, and that tax is totally buried. We're not really taxing anyone, we're just imposing environmental purity on Americans. You know, there's only three things government can do. It can tax us, it can regulate us, or it can inflate us. And no one, I think, who has looked at the amount of money now being spent, the trillions and trillions of dollars being spent, believes that it's going to be possible to avoid taxes today, taxes tomorrow, or inflation. And that's what all of us, I think, fear, that as bad as the situation is now, by essentially raising spending and by borrowing against America's future, our children's future, the tax burden that we're now imposing on Americans, whether it's through inflation or through honest taxes or through borrowing, is going to be extending into the infinite future. Bush administration started this mess, but Obama looks like he's doubling up on it.
Welcome back to the Weekend Uptake. I'm Jim Norton, joined here by John Hoffus. John, welcome.
Good afternoon.
Thanks for being here. John, you are, if my memory serves, an information security consultant, and you were a judge at the 2009 Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition, is that right?
I was a judge for the state competition, Upper Midwest, here down in Inver Hills Community College in Inver Grove Heights.
For those of us who don't defend anything in the cybersphere, what's the nature of this competition? How does it work?
Well, the competition is set up with teams from different colleges. We had 6 teams from Minnesota colleges. We had 6 from Minnesota at the state competition, and we had 6 from Minnesota, from Michigan, and from Illinois at the regional competition. Each team is given a network of computers that they are then given responsibility for. And so they take this network and they actually begin securing and patching systems, installing antivirus and configuring firewalls and things of this nature. The whole time throughout this weekend-long competition, I'm also giving them what we called in the competition business injects or tasks. So it could be anywhere from install a printer to set up a new server and configure a new website on that server. And then at the same time, through both of those lines of business, there's a red team of professional hackers actually trying to break into their network the whole time.
So there's a red team kind of going after every team's network, and if your network isn't sufficiently secure, the red team gets in, and
Exactly.
presumably you forfeit points.
Yes.
What
exactly.
kind of skills are involved in this? What makes someone talented at this particular activity?
Well, I think in this activity, a lot of the successful teams had a real methodical approach to securing their network and managing that system. Pretty similar to a real-world situation in that respect. The other thing that really makes someone excel in security is a willingness and an eagerness to break things, figure out how to break it, and then responding by figuring out how to secure it again.
Well, it sounds as though this is the sort of thing that's going to have an increasingly valuable application in the real world. What's going on out there in terms of threats on the international scene that you've been seeing just in current events over the last few months?
Sure. Well, I know about a month ago, around 2 weeks ago, the New York Times ran an article pointing out something called GhostNet, and this was actually an international network of hacked computer systems in governments around the world. I think it was something like 105 countries that they found systems in this network. And what's happening is, that the malicious, I'll call them malicious attackers or hackers, are sort of organizing better, and so they all are. They're hacking these government systems en masse, and then they're putting them together in one massive network that they can then centrally manage, actually. And they use this system to both carry out attacks on things like Google and Yahoo, like a simple denial of service that we've heard about in the past. But they also use these networks to try and gather information. Now, there hasn't been any clear indication that any of the recent events that we've seen there had specific ties to an international government, but I think there are a lot of people that think that there might be a tie to somebody like China or Russia.
Well, there was some interesting stuff going on during the conflict between Russia and Georgia, if memory serves, where Georgian websites, particularly government websites, were under a tremendous amount of internet assault during that conflict. And I think it was a New York Times piece I read that pointed out that in terms of expense, it's not real costly to get someone up and running to try and hack and take down a network. Is that right? Is it something that enabling?
Absolutely. The Russia and Georgia situation was compounded by the fact that all of Georgia's connectivity actually ran through Russia. And so they didn't have a redundant connection going out to another nation in the area.
Sure.
And so Russia basically had a stranglehold on their pipeline, and all they had to do is have enough people throwing lots of traffic at it, committing a denial of service, like we've seen against the Yahoo or Google in the past. And really, it would be the equivalent of having 50 people come into the room right now and start screaming at us.
Right.
No one would be able to hear us because everyone is just yelling. It doesn't take any skill or ability, it just takes a lot of voices.
This is all a little, from my perspective, a little abstract when you're talking about a nation-to-nation level. What do individuals have to fear in terms of a lack of security online? Why should we be concerned as people?
Well, as individuals, computers, and we have broadband at home, and it's always on, and most of us leave our computers on all the time. It leaves our systems open as targets more frequently than it used to be back in the days of AOL, when you had 20 hours a month or 10 hours a month, so you never left it on. For us as individuals, the real threat is that somebody compromises our system and uses our system to carry out something like a denial of service attack. In general, I think the majority of users don't have a whole lot to worry about in terms of being specifically targeted as part of something like an identity theft scheme. Those individuals that have their identity theft, or identity stolen, wind up having their information compromised by larger organizations that had their information. Like if you use a credit card at Best Buy or Circuit City, Circuit City is no more.
Right, absolutely. So what can individuals do to protect themselves? Are there one or two or three simple things that we should be aware of if we're using a computer with a broadband connection, for example?
Sure. Number one I would say is make sure that your system gets patched regularly. Make sure that you're using antivirus, and don't be afraid to turn it off or unplug your wireless access point or your modem if it's not going to be used for a while.
Okay. Well, John Hoffus, thank you so much for joining us here on The Uptake.
Thank you.
We are going to go to the Uptake Roundtable, but before we go to that, we're going to be watching a video from a local Tea Party protest talking about the tax changes that the Obama administration have been making. So we'll go to that video, and then we'll join you at the roundtable.
2, 1.
Welcome back to the Weekend Uptake. I'm Jim Norton here with the Roundtable. Sitting to my left is Jason Barnett, Executive Director of the Uptake. Jason, welcome.
Thank you.
And Max Barber over here on the far left, playwright and editor of Secrets of the City Talk. Max, thanks.
Thank you.
Sitting to my right, Joe Bodell of the Minnesota Progressive Project. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Chuck Tomlinson from Cosmic Slop, my favorite intro. Chuck, welcome back.
Thanks a lot.
The first topic we want to hit today, and this ties into the video we just saw, was the phenomenon of tea parties that have been sweeping the country this last week, tax week. And there seems to be a fairly genuine outcry or level of outrage over taxes that's taking place, mostly directed at this point at the Obama administration. Chuck, I want to ask you, what do you think is really driving this movement, and are there any sort of legitimate or thought-provoking points that you're seeing bubbling up in the discourse here?
I think that the genuine point is people that don't like being taxed a lot.
Yep.
They didn't like being taxed a lot under any administration, period. And now it's coupled with a perceived lack of control of what's going on in the country. Somehow their guys aren't running the show, so the financial outrages are that much more atrocious, and the doom that they're facing is much more precipitous. So the paranoia is running higher.
There seem to be particular projects that are touching off that paranoia that are bubbling up. And
my favorite is the nonsensical ones, the ones that have been trumpeted by the legislators. This goes back a month or so about saying that somehow one of these things was going to have a train go from Vegas to Disneyland or something that didn't exist. Anything that somehow doesn't benefit the individual, somehow, the concept that's lost in any sort of taxation debate is the idea that a greater good exists. And when that goes out the window, it's hard to have an intelligent discussion with somebody who sees somehow anything beyond the police, the fire, and roads is excess and doesn't benefit everybody. That makes it tough.
Joe, what's your take on what's driving this and whether there's some substantial points kind of being brought up here?
Well, I think there is a lot of legitimate anger. My question for not just the participants in the Tea Party events, but the organizers is, where was it a year ago when the Bush administration was embarking on this adventure in the financial markets? Where was it while we were fighting two wars and, frankly, just not paying for them up front? In every other time of war in our nation's history, there's been a sense of shared sacrifice. There's been a sense that we need to pay for this, and we need to pay for it now, and we didn't have that in Iraq and Afghanistan, and yet there were no dramatic protests, there were no tea parties, there was none of this populist outrage. The question that I would have is what the partisan motivations for these events are. And whether it's fair to say that the Obama administration is responsible for increasing the deficit so dramatically when a lot of these events, a lot of the problems underlying those deficits were going on long before Obama ever became a candidate for president, let alone president.
Max, what's your take on the battle over taxes that's playing itself out on the national stage right now?
Well, I find it interesting that they've named themselves after the original Tea Parties, because those were a protest against taxation without representation. But it seems that for a good portion of the population nowadays, even taxation with representation is intolerable. They really just don't like their taxes being used on anything that doesn't directly benefit them. I think you were right that a concept of a common good has started to slip out of public discourse, and I'm not quite sure why that is. But a good portion of the taxes I pay don't directly benefit me. Like, I pay for a lot of people's kids to go to school. I don't have children myself, but I'd much rather those children be in school than be in my yard or be doing nothing or wind up uneducated in particular. And so my concern is that without being able to discuss the value of taxation and when taxation is useful when it doesn't directly benefit you, you can't even have a dialogue.
Jason, what's your take on it?
I was confused to begin with where there all these teabaggers are out there. I thought they were talking about something completely different. You just Google teabag and you'll see what I mean. So I think it was kind of interesting of what they actually branded themselves with, begin with trying to take this old term of throwing tea in the Hudson River, and then they started calling themselves teabaggers, where they didn't realize the slang
the cultural gulf.
Sexually perverse nature of that. I thought that was kind of funny myself. But
I think the analog is very interesting. When you talk about the original Tea Party, you're right, they were protesting taxation without representation. I think the analog here is they're protesting taxation with representation they don't like. And that seems to run counter to the American democratic ideal, where a majority says we want this person to represent us, or a majority of states vote for this person to be president, and the rest may not like that, but the fact is elections have consequences. 4 years ago we were told elections have consequences, and non-Bush supporters should sit down and shut up.
But might there be something legitimate to the concern that we are in a very difficult economic time, and what the government seems to be doing is pulling in yet more money and dispersing yet more money in a huge kind of gout of spending? Isn't there some validity to that concern?
I think there is, but I think it is one area where the government has failed. And not speaking in partisan terms about the Obama administration versus the Bush administration, I think government as a whole has failed to elucidate the issues that underlie this crisis, because they are so incredibly complex that no one person is able to understand them all. So trying to explain that to the masses in a 30-second soundbite is virtually impossible. The result is people see money in, people see money out, and no real results on the other side.
I also think that if you look at these events that happened all over the country, the common thread in them all is that there is a large percentage of people that are very angry about the financial situation going on, and this angle is spinning it for taxes, and the agenda behind it is try to subvert the Obama administration. But I think there is a lot of legitimate problems and concerns in the general public about understanding this fiscal situation. It is a complicated thing. People don't understand why the banks are in trouble. They don't understand why Wall Street's in trouble.
Which makes it hard for me to swallow the rhetoric that's coming down from party organizations, particularly from the Republicans, that say, the Obama administration comes to town and says, well, it looks like there's very little oversight and regulation. We're going to have more of that. So the knee-jerk reactions, you're choking the market. You're not letting the free market breathe. And the answer is, well, so you want us to go back to what just broke horribly.
Right.
And then you apply that same logical, line of reasoning to, you name it, food oversight or taxation.
I think a lot of the power people pushing a lot of this stuff are actually very afraid of what you just said, is that the free market is what just failed.
Exactly.
And so how do you keep an economic structure going when the corruption and these financial transactions basically broke the free market?
God forbid that the populist people find out that it's not actually about our party versus their party, but in fact there's an issue of power and control that transcends the partisan lines.
Let me jump in with a Minnesota statistic. Last November, in the midst of the banking meltdown, 57% of Minnesotans voted yes to increase the sales tax by 0.3% to boost arts and environmental funding. And Joe, let me ask you, do you think there's a difference between the way Minnesotans view taxation and maybe the nation as a whole in terms of this idea of a public good and what taxes are used for?
I think Minnesotans have a history of being a little bit more conscious of the concept of a public good or a greater good when it comes to taxation in particular than a lot of places in the country. I think the sales tax bill that passed last November probably wouldn't have passed 6 to 10 years ago, though. I think there's a growing sense of frustration among rank and file voters in this state that nothing's been getting done, problems are getting worse in government, and as a result, something needs to be done. People recognize that there are big deficits and not enough funding, and they see policies like those that are being put forth by Governor Pawlenty that choke off local government aid and force cities and towns to raise their property tax levies, and they see that as a significant problem, and, as you say, are willing to stand up for that greater good and pay a little bit more in a sales tax.
I'd agree with that too. And I grew up in the Deep South, and I have to say that the infrastructure in Minnesota is significantly better. And if you're talking about the roads, if you're talking about the school system, when I grew up in a state that was number 48 in education and moved to Minnesota, which was number 2 at the time. I don't know what it is now. And there's levels of investment that have been made in Minnesota over a period of time that people got used to. Now, I think that in the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a reversal of that. Our roads are definitely nothing to be proud of right now, and our schools are flagging. I think they're still pretty good, though. So when you talk about the rest of the country, there are definitely regions of the country that don't have a history of civic support. They allow their zoning regulations, their taxation to be a lot less tight, and so people aren't used to it. And so when the federal government's doing these big investments, they don't really understand it.
Jason, let me switch topics on you, but I'll pitch the question back in your direction. Recent polls show a solid majority of Minnesotans suggesting that former senator or current senator, depending on the look on it, Norm Coleman should give up at this point and concede the election to Al Franken. Franken just won a fairly thumping victory in a lower court, and Coleman has yet to file his appeal to the Minnesota Supreme Court on that. He's, I think, on day 6 at this point of his 10-day window to do that. Is this blatant foot dragging on Coleman's part, or do you think there's a chance he could still drop out? What's your take on the situation with Coleman and Franken right now?
Well, I haven't changed my broad opinion of what's going to happen, but I'm starting to get my confusion of what Norm's going to do is growing. I still think he's going to appeal. The Minnesota Supreme Court may or may not hear it. If they do hear it, it's going to be short, and they're just going to turn it down. And then Coleman will probably try to take it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I don't think they'll even take the case. And so I think that's what's going to happen. I don't see any hints that Norm Coleman is going to be trying to slow it down, although I think the public pressure is picking up. When you have Larry King, talking about Twitter the other night, and the Norm Coleman race comes up, and they call him a sore loser. There's definitely an impression out there that Norm Coleman is dragging his feet too long and should get out. So you really, I don't know. I mean, I think he's going to appeal, but the pressure is building.
Max, what's your take on it?
Well, there's whispers coming out now that Coleman may be considering a gubernatorial run. If that's legitimate, he's self-sabotaging at this point. Frustration with the process now is reaching a fever pitch. There was on the WCCO blog a couple of days ago, there was a discussion about whether Coleman should drop out or not, and it got a massive response, and almost universally people felt like the process was taking too long. Coleman should already have dropped out. I do think he's dragging his heels. I don't think that he's a stupid man, and he must be aware at this point that the likelihood of anything being reversed is non-existent. I mean, that response from the 3-judge panel pretty much explicitly said that this was nonsense, that he couldn't win, that the legal viewpoints that he were putting forward to try and make his case were not legitimate. I don't know what the reasoning behind that is, except the longer he keeps the process going, the less time his opponent has in the Senate, which is a very cynical approach. If that's the actual reason behind it, of course, he's formerly a lawyer. It may just be reflex for him to sue. But I honestly think that if Coleman wants a future in Minnesota politics, he's undermining it right now.
One thing, and anyone can jump in on this if you got an observation, I haven't seen the same level of popular outrage that polls are showing, and maybe what you were seeing on the WCCO blog, for example, reflected in the Star Tribune or Public Radio or Pioneer Press. Is anyone else getting that same feeling, or is that anger actually starting to seep through?
Well, I just would point it to the owners of both the local papers, and I think there's an intentional desire of the editorial board of both papers to keep any sort of tension to Norm Coleman to leave down to a minimum. I think it's pretty clear that they're trying to not do that within their own papers. I don't know about the other media.
Did you watch the full clip of him on the Star Tribune? Of him sitting down with the editorial board? They had the video of him
this week.
Yeah.
No, I totally missed it.
You need to see this.
Recap it for us.
It's he got a little testy with him about this. He's still a little ticked off that the reporters went on and the ones that wound up in the ad right before the election.
Right. Okay.
Up in St. Cloud.
I read about.
Could have been quiet.
They could have been quiet. Why didn't they just keep their mouths shut? Otherwise, I'd be in. But the quote,
reporters doing their job.
I know. Well, no, he's saying they knew there's trackers. His argument is they knew there are trackers from the other campaign filming them talking to me. So when they go and talk to me, they know that they might wind up in a DFL ad. So they did that on purpose. It was kind of sad because he got testy. But the headline I liked the best in the strip said that it said Coleman, I believe the law is on our side, or I believe the law is on my side. And I thought that's a pretty bold, mouthy thing for a guy to say who just lost an election contest, whose personal whose judges disagree with him. His personal finances are a factor into both a private lawsuit, a possible FBI investigation, and if he's so lucky enough to win to get his job back, he'd have to face an ethics investigation. So if that's called the law being on your side, he's sitting pretty.
I think Norm Coleman is in a very interesting position. From a partisan standpoint, obviously it all indications are that he's not going to go back to the Senate. But here's a guy who used to be a Democrat, became a Republican, has run statewide 3 times, and failed to win 50% statewide 3 times against a wrestler, a dead guy, and a comedian.
I've heard that line. I like that one.
He just can't win. Yeah. And he got lucky in that he was running against a dead guy and managed to get to the Senate for 6 years. But something about the person that is Norm Coleman just has a very funny place in Minnesota's political history.
He's waiting for a Sally Field moment so that everybody will like him.
Yeah.
They will really like him.
It's just a very unique position for him to be in. And, speaking about a gubernatorial run, there are a lot of factors that would feed into that. But I think the Democrats and, God forbid, the Independence Party would have to come up with a very interesting candidate in 2010 to beat the wrestler and the comedian. And I would look forward to that race. That would be very interesting.
Well, let's jump topics one more time. This week, President Obama announced a major high-speed rail initiative. I believe we've got some video of that initiative we can show just to recap what the president announced.
I want to, in addition to Ray LaHood and Joe Biden, Rahm Emanuel, all of who have worked on this extensively, I also want to acknowledge Jim Oberstar and Rob Andrews, 2 of our finest members of Congress, but people who understand that investing in our infrastructure, investing in our transportation system pays enormous dividends over the long term. So I'm grateful to them for being here. I've been speaking a lot lately about what we're doing to break free of our economic crisis, so to put people back to work and move this nation from recession to recovery. And one area in which we can make investments with impact both immediate and lasting is in America's infrastructure. And that's why the Recovery and Reinvestment Plan we passed not 2 months ago included the most sweeping investment in our infrastructure since President Eisenhower built the interstate highway system in the 1950s. And these efforts will save money by untangling gridlock and saving lives by improving our roads, and save or create 150,000 jobs, mostly in the private sector, by the end of next year. Already it's put Americans back to work. And so far, we're ahead of schedule, we're under budget, and adhering to the highest standards of transparency and accountability. But if we want to move from recovery to prosperity, then we have to do a little bit more. We also have to build a new foundation for our future growth. Today, our aging system of highways and byways, air routes, and rail lines is hindering that growth. Our highways are clogged with traffic, costing us $80 billion a year in lost productivity and wasted fuel. Our airports are choked with increased loads. Some of you flew down here, and you know what that was about. We're at the mercy of fluctuating gas prices all too often. We pump too many greenhouse gases into the air. What we need then is a smart transportation system equal to the needs of the 21st century. A system that reduces travel times and increases mobility. A system that reduces congestion and boosts productivity. A system that reduces destructive emissions and creates jobs. What we're talking about is a vision for high-speed rail in America. Imagine boarding a train in the center of a city. No racing to an airport and across a terminal, no delays, no sitting on the tarmac, no lost luggage, no taking off your shoes. Imagine whisking through towns at speeds over 100 miles an hour, walking only a few steps to public transportation, and ending up just blocks from your destination. Imagine what a great project that would be to rebuild America. Now, all of you know this is not some fanciful pie-in-the-sky vision of the future. It is now. It is happening right now. It's been happening for decades. The problem is it's been happening elsewhere, not here. In France, high-speed rail has pulled regions from isolation, ignited growth, remade quiet towns into thriving tourist destinations. In Spain, a high-speed line between Madrid and Seville is so successful that more people travel between those cities by rail than by car and airplane combined. China, where service began just 2 years ago, may have more miles of high-speed rail service than any other country just 5 years from now. And Japan, the nation that unveiled the first high-speed rail system, is already at work building the next, a line that will connect Tokyo with Osaka at speeds of over 300 miles per hour. So it's being done. It's just not being done here.